You know the line. The movie made it immortal, short, brutal, almost sacred. It sounds like destiny, it sounds like glory, it sounds like a choice. But what if that image, the lone king at the head of a flawless phalanx, a man of nature-made heroism, is a comfortable lie? What if Leonidas was not the spontaneous emblem of courage the films sell, but the product of a state that manufactured warriors by design? What if the man Hollywood turned into myth was, in a very literal way, created to be expendable? Leonidas was no spontaneous hero. He was engineered. If you want myth-busting history, hit like and subscribe and stay with me. This is not a story of simple courage and cinematic last stands. This is a story of systems, of rituals, of legal cages, and calculated sacrifice. It is about how a polis turned its best men into instruments and chose them, by law and custom, to die. Sparta was not Athens. It did not prize debate, theater, or the private flourishing of citizens. Sparta was a machine. Its gears were social structures and rituals designed to keep a tiny elite in power over a subjugated mass and to prepare for constant war. At its heart lay the agage, a child-rearing program that was as much social engineering as education. Boys were taken at 7, family ties were loosened, clothing and comfort were stripped away. One tunic often lasted an entire year. Footwear was scant or absent. Hunger was an instrument. Theft was encouraged as a lesson in stealth. But if you were caught, the beating was worse than the theft. Pain was routine. Cold was routine. Shame, humiliation, silence, endurance. These were the curriculum. The aim was not merely to create tough soldiers. It was to make obedience habitual. Laconic speech, the cultural insistence on saying little, was enforced, and silence itself became discipline. The agage trained attention away from individual desire toward the collective will. Men learned to subordinate grief and fear. They practiced killing, not as a dreadful exception, but as a practiced craft. They learned to be readable as one body in the phalanx. Their names mattered less than their order in formation. Outside the training grounds stood another mechanism, the helots. Enslaved peoples, largely from Messenia and Laconia, provided the economic muscle that freed Spartan males for constant military focus. The existence of helots made Sparta a state of internal control as much as external aggression. The Cryptia, a semi-official reign of terror, a state-sanctioned hunt for potentially dangerous helots, was a reminder that Sparta maintained itself by suppression. The agage prepared boys to oversee, terrorize, and, when commanded, execute that order. This is the context that shaped Leonidas. He was born into royalty, yes, but not as a presumptive sovereign of an untroubled line. He was a third son. Anaxandridas was his father, and the family chronology mattered. In the rigid logic of Hellenic succession, primogeniture was not a given the way modern readers imagine. His older brothers, Cleomenes and Dorios, inhabited very different fates, and those fates shaped how Leonidas came to power. Cleomenes, the eldest, was the heir apparent. According to Herodotus, Cleomenes's behavior became erratic. There are accounts that point to mental collapse, others that hint at political violence. Modern scholars debate the precise causes. Some propose illness, some a political purge, others manipulation by the ephors, the 5 magistrates whose power could remove a king's freedom to act. The sources are messy. What is clear is that Cleomenes was effectively sidelined and then dead to the contest. Dorius, the second son, left Sparta in frustration. He sailed west to try his luck in Sicily and Africa. Herodotus follows his wanderings and records that he died abroad, trying to set up his own rule. Dorius's failure closed another avenue for royal succession. Leonidas, the third son, thus rose not because he was expected to, but because he outlasted the others. He was a spare part who became the central cog when the machine needed a body. Being a spare made him pliable. A third son had fewer political alliances, fewer entanglements, and crucially, less of a personal power base inside the elite family networks. That made him useful to the ephors. The ephors were the constitutional brakes on Spartan kingship. They could check royal initiatives, call assemblies, and exert pressure that in practice could constrain a king's movements. The balance between kingship and ephorate was one of Sparta's defining features. Two royal houses reduced the danger of dynastic absolutism. 5 ephors kept the monarchy accountable, or, if you like, controllable. And control, in Sparta, often meant ritual and law. The Carneia in some anglicizations, was a religious festival tied to Apollo. During certain religious observances, military campaigns were restricted. The exact terms and extent of these prohibitions are debated by historians, but the political effect was certain. On the eve of Xerxes' invasion, official law and ritual practice limited what kings could do without sanction. The ephors could and did insist on compliance. All of this matters when the Persian shadow fell across Greece. The Persian Empire, under Xerxes, was not some abstract threat. It was a mobilization on a scale the Greeks had never seen. Herodotus lists fleets and armies in numbers that stagger the imagination. Modern historians parse and doubt the totals, offering far lower estimates, but none denies the scale. Xerxes assembled a force intended not just to subdue a few cities, but to assert imperial will across the Aegean. He sent envoys to Greek cities demanding earth and water, symbolic tokens of subjugation. The message was clear: obey or be erased. According to some Greek testimonies, Persian envoys who pressed the demand found themselves thrown into a pit and buried for their insolence. Herodotus records versions of this story, and the image lodged in Greek memory. It was not merely an insult. It was a declaration. The great kings expected submission, and they would meet resistance with annihilation. Sparta, for all its oligarchic coldness, understood the existential dimension of this confrontation. But Sparta was also a polity bound to law, ritual, and precedent. When the ephors and the assembly debated how to respond, they did so with a complicated knot of constraints: sacred calendars, legal obligations, and the ruthless calculus of power. Into that knot stepped Leonidas. By then, his personal narrative had collided with geopolitics. Leonidas faced a decision that was not merely tactical. It was constitutional. It was ritualized. According to Herodotus, and echoed by later tradition, the Delphic oracle played a role. Now, oracles are slippery evidence. They perform a social function as much as provide prophecy. They give permission and meaning. They crystallize risk into ritual terms. Herodotus reports that the oracle's guidance, however phrased and however ambiguous, was read as indicating that Sparta could be saved only at the cost of a king's life. Read that way, the mission became sacrificial as well as strategic. The oracle did not issue a battle plan. It issued a symbolic sanction. Something must be given. Leonidas's response fits the logic. He could not lead the entire Spartan army openly. The Carneia festival and ephemeral constraints made such mobilization problematic without violating sacred law and inviting internal political backlash. So he made a workaround. He took his personal guard, the king's household troop traditionally called the hippies, or 300 chosen Spartiates, and he supplemented them with allies from other Greek cities. But the 300 were not a random band. There was a rule, explicit in the accounts that reached us. Only those who had living sons were allowed to go. This was not a sentimental requirement. It was a calculated insurance policy. Think about that rule for a moment. If the state planned sacrifice, it wanted to ensure its future. Men with living sons left heirs to carry the bloodline and maintain property and ritual obligations. It minimized the demographic damage to Sparta's fragile ruling class. In a city where the number of full citizens, Spartiates, was limited, The logic is brutally clear. The state could consume the bodies of its best soldiers, but it wanted heirs remaining to perpetuate the system. The living sons condition turns what films present as spontaneous bravery into an act of collective, managed self-destruction. This is an interpretation grounded in institutional evidence. It reads a cultural practice as political calculus. It is not to deny individual bravery or loyalty. Men who left for Thermopylae may have believed they were defending their homeland. They may have chosen honor willingly. Yet the arrangement shows the hand of a polity that turned its sons into expendable symbols while insulating its reproductive future. The selection of the 300 is one of those moments where ritual, law, and strategy fuse. They were elite. They were trained. They were chosen by family, by status, and by those delicate calculations about heirs. They were also human beings raised to see endurance and sacrifice as virtue. The agoge had done its work. So Leonidas arrives at Thermopylae not as a king leading his entire people, but as the head of a curated detachment, royal bodyguards bristling with meaning and ready, by design and by law, to die. He chooses a narrow defile, a natural choke point that can negate Persian numerical advantage. Thermopylae is geography weaponized. It is a gate between Thessaly and central Greece, a place where the massive Persian host could not deploy all at once. Strategy and symbolism overlap. A small force could check a larger one. A stand there could be newsworthy. It could be calibrated to buy time. Make no mistake, Thermopylae was a bottleneck. In military terms, it was a rational place to contest and advance. But there was a difference between a location where a much smaller force could delay an invasion and a location where a force could hope to win a decisive victory. The Spartan calculus, influenced by oracles, by religious festivals, by ephemeral constraints, by demographic logic, did not aim for decisive victory as much as deterrence and sacrificial delay. The job was to make the Persian timetable worse, to create a cost that would buy a few days and perhaps, more importantly, a symbol. The early days were violent and intense. Persian waves came forward and found the Spartan line immovable. The phalanx, the dense formation of overlapping shields and angled spears, worked as taught. Shields met shield. Spears struck in disciplined arcs. The sound was not glorious, it was mechanical. A grinding of polished bronze and the dull thump of bodies meeting bodies. Herodotus measures time with a mixture of awe and wariness, assaults after assaults, bodies strewn but gaps unyielding. The Persians tried frontal assaults, they tried fresh troops, they tried elite units, the so-called immortals, whose name alone is meant to instill fear. The immortals struck, they failed to break the line. Day became a small triumph for a tiny band of men. There are human details that make the machine feel lived in. The Spartans were cold. They had trained to live with less. Food was meager, yet they ate and fought. The allied contingents, Thespians, Thebans, others, stood alongside them to varying degrees of loyalty. Some sources emphasize Greek unity, others highlight fractures. The Spartans' behavior had cultic undertones, ritualized discipline, short speech, public codes of honor. Language, too, was part of the formation. Laconic replies became legend. The Greek imagination needed those laconic phrases as soundbites, and later storytellers obliged. But the stakes were tactical as well as symbolic. Holding Thermopylae bought the Greek fleet time to maneuver. The Athenian admiral Themistocles was orchestrating a naval strategy that depended on delay. Salamis, a congested strait, perfect for Greek triremes to harass a larger fleet, required Greeks to lure the Persian ships into disadvantageous waters. Every day the Persians were held at Thermopylae was a day for that maritime plan to gestate, for alliances to stiffen, for cities to mobilize. It would not last. The story of Thermopylae turns on betrayal. The mountain paths that flank the pass were known to locals. One of those locals, a man later named Ephialtes in the sources, betrayed the Greeks by showing the Persians a goat track that climbed around the narrow pass. The existence of such paths had always been a tactical risk. It is the kind of thing commanders must deny, scout, and block. Whether Ephialtes acted for money, for fear, or for resentment is disputed. Herodotus reports the name as a stain on the story, a human fulcrum that changed the scale of the fight. A turning point that could have been another example of calculated risk management. The Greeks could have secured the flanks, became the opening for a strategic squeeze. But even here the narrative is not simple. Betrayal made possible a tactical encirclement, but the Greek commanders were not fools. They recognized when the day had gone against them. What happened next is where the intersection of law, ritual, and brutality shows its face in the most literal form. Orders to withdraw, last stands, and the deliberate decision of Leonidas to remain. At a certain moment, Leonidas dismissed most of the allied forces. He ordered them to safety, to preserve their cities and continue the larger war effort. What remained were the Spartans and a small contingent that chose to stay. That decision can be read many ways. It can be read as self-sacrifice, as the highest form of courage, as loyalty to a mate and comrades. It can also be read as the culmination of a long process, a polity choosing to send its fittest men into a choke where death was likely, framed by religious sanction and closed by legal constraints that made the king's presence necessary or desirable. And then there was combat turned personal. The axes of state, ephors, oracle, law, had converged on a man and his guard. The battle narrowed. Spears and shields became private instruments of a public act. The Spartans, trained to fight as one, fought as a designed collective. The material consequences were immediate and visible. The Persians could not easily shuttle infinite numbers into a tight funnel. Their tactical options were limited. But their numbers and reserves were enormous. So the fight turned into attrition. The Spartans fought until they could fight no more. Here is a crucial point of interpretation. Leonidas's choice to stay was not merely an individual act of valor. It also fit a Spartan script. Ritual sacrifice. The formal and informal practice of offering human life for the city's salvation has an institutional character. The Delphic pronouncement that a king must die, the living son's rule for volunteers, and the ephemeral pressure all made the stand less an improvised act and more a foreseen instrument. Which raises a question that unsettles modern sensibilities. When a state structures obedience and then selects which of its citizens are to die for the symbol of the city, at what point does heroism become state-engineered monstrosity? Is a man forced by custom and law into a death that will benefit a polity's cohesion still purely heroic? Or is he a tool with a heart? There are no easy answers. The Greeks celebrated the dead. Songs were composed, monuments set up, and stories told. But the mechanisms that produce those martyrs deserve scrutiny. To see Leonidas purely as a man of nature is to ignore the social machinery that prepared and presented him as a sacrifice. We can trace the consequences in concrete terms. The Persians did not march unimpeded. They paused. The Greeks gained hours and days. That time mattered for Themistocles and the navy at Salamis. It mattered for the political will of cities that were wavering. It mattered in rumor and morale. The narrative of Thermopylae turned into a political asset. The dead became a rallying cry. Xerxes' desecration of bodies, stripping, humiliating, and reportedly crucifying limbs, further inflamed Greek sentiment. That reaction underscores the duality. A body meant to be a symbol, desecrated, then resurrected in memory as a moral outrage that drove unity. This is where myth and machinery meet. Propaganda, not in the modern conspiratorial sense, but in the sense of stories told to shape public feeling, rewired Thermopylae from a tactical delay into moral capital. Poets, historians, and leaders turned a local sacrifice into pan-Hellenic meaning. Herodotus preserved versions of the story that later writers polished into legend. Later symbolism erased ambiguity. The king became an icon. The state, meanwhile, kept functioning on the logic that had produced the sacrifice in the first place. We are still in the hours before the decisive end. The goat path has been revealed. The Persians have maneuvered. Leonidas has dismissed the bulk of the allies and stayed with his hand-picked guard. The mountain air is thin and bitter. The smell of smoke from distant fires drifts in with the dust raised by marching boots. The Spartan formations tighten. The cries of men are low. Spears are leveled. The oracle's shadow hangs over the action like a legal summons. The ephors are back in Sparta, watching the city's future be ensured by sons left at home while a handful give their bodies. What happens next? The encirclement, the final charges, the fighting to recover the king's body, the alleged desecration by Xerxes, and the aftermath that transforms a military delay into the seed of a pan-Hellenic resistance, is the moment where the narrative will pivot from manufacture to myth. It is where the machine's product becomes a symbol that outlives its makers. But before that pivot can be resolved, we must keep one truth firmly in view. Thermopylae is not merely a story of battlefield tactics. It is a case study in how a polity can turn human beings into tools of its own survival. The Agoge had taught discipline. The Helot system had enforced social order. The ephors had constrained kingship. The oracle had given ritual permission. And the living sun's rule had made death strategic. Together, these elements reframed Leonidas's death from an isolated act of courage into a chapter in a larger program. When the Persian columns find the mountain path, the moral architecture of Sparta will be tested in the hardest way. Will the ritual match the reality? Will the sacrifice produce the political unity it was meant to produce? Will the names carved in memory outweigh the calculations in council chambers? Those are the questions that hang heavy over the pass. They are not rhetorical ornament. They are the fault lines that split simple narratives of heroism and reveal the machinery beneath. The image of Leonidas, spear forward, cloak blowing, mouth grim, is a powerful one. But to fix on that image alone is to miss why he was there, why he stayed, and why his death was, in many respects, the expected output of a society built to extract obedience and secure lineage. What follows is the moment when private courage and public design collide at the very edge of history. The Persians climb the goat track. The line is breached from behind. Leonidas faces the immediate calculus: stand and die to hold a line that has already been encircled, or withdraw and preserve the remnant of his hand-picked force. He chooses to stay. The decision is personal, yet undeniably institutional. It is a human act, shaped by a culture that taught that such acts were not only permissible, but necessary. Thermopylae will not end in a tidy moral. It will not retroactively dissolve the Spartan system's brutality, nor will it reduce the men who fought there to mere cogs. They were both. Individuals possessed of courage and members of a machinery that shaped them into instruments. The paradox is the point. The state produced its guardian, and when that guardian performed the duty asked of him, his death became the seed of a wider resistance. The battle narrows now to moments. Spears crack. Blood darkens the soil of the defile. The Persians push from the flanks. Bodies pile. The Spartan core remains. A cry rises. Whether a chant of defiance or a last breath, the sources vary, and the story careens toward its conclusion. If you want to open the next layer, to see how the final hours of combat played out, how Xerxes handled the victory, how the Greeks turned a tragic delay into a strategic and moral triumph, and how history forged Leonidas's image into a legend, Watch the deep dive on the aftermath and the ideological construction of Thermopylae in the linked video. There's more to untangle: the propaganda, the funerary cult, and the long shadow that Spartan society cast across Western imagination. For now, the pass holds its breath. The goat path has been found. The line tightens. The kingship of Sparta presses its claims in bronze and blood. The machine does what it was built to do. The question remains: when the smoke clears, will we remember Leonidas as the freestanding hero the movies made him, or as the product of a system that chose him to die so that a state might live? When the goat's path was shown, the Persians did not rush in at once like a mythic tide. They probed, they sent troops, they tested. But the logistic advantage that had been useless in the narrow defile now mattered. Men who had once been excluded by geography could now press the flank. The line that had held for days was suddenly vulnerable on two fronts. The calculus changed. The narrow pass that had been a force multiplier for the Greeks was now a trap with a new exit. Leonidas saw the geometry of defeat. He had lived his life learning to recognize closed shapes, formations, festivals, the circles of custom that insulated power. This was a circle with the door opened. Retreat could save men who might win battles elsewhere. Retreat could keep intact a remnant to carry on the war. But retreat would also mean giving up the symbolic stand. It would let the Persians call the bluff of Greek resistance. The Delphic pronouncement, read as saying a king must die, hung in the air like law. The Ephors had already ensured Sparta's future through the living son's condition. The ritual calculus left a narrow set of socially acceptable options. So Leonidas did what Spartans were shaped to do. He closed ranks. He accepted the institutional script and made it his own last act. He dismissed most of the allied contingents, sending them back over the passes and down to safety. He ordered the Thebans and others who were promised sanctuary to leave. Some accounts suggest the Thebans were compelled by coercion and political pressure. Others imply they remained because they were compelled by circumstance. The sources do not agree on every detail. This is always the historian's discipline: to hold ambiguity and still tell what must be told. Those who stayed were a fragment, Spartans, a handful of Thespians who refused to go, and perhaps a small band of others who elected to share the fate. They made their ring again. Shields overlapped. Spears projected like a bronze forest. The Persians came with fresh troops, with archers, with cavalry where the ground allowed. The Immortals tried to force a breach. The Immortals were named to terrify as much as they were to fight. They struck, and they found bronze and blood, and the disciplined cohesion of men trained to lose their individuality in formation. The final hours were not cinematic in the modern sense. There were no slow-motion, solitary close-ups. There was noise, hard and repetitive. Shields struck, then rebounded. Spears plunged and were pulled back. Men grunted. Men fell. The Spartans kept the rhythm that the Agoge had burned into their bodies. Death unfolded not as a sudden heroic tableau, but as repeated acts: thrust, parry, grunt, collapse. It was a machine, made of flesh. And yet, within that machine, beat human choices. Men looked at one another, remembered wives and sons left behind, and kept fighting. Some shouted laconic phrases, which later writers would polish into epigrams and citations. Others said nothing. Some begged. Some swore. The sources, Herodotus explicitly, later poets implicitly, give us fragments of language and behavior that have been folded into legend. But folding is not the same as erasing. The men at Thermopylae were people performing a role ordained by law, ritual, and culture. And they did so with courage that remains undeniable even while its manufacture is clear. As the Persians pushed, they also tried to get at the king's body. Killing the leader in archaic warfare had both tactical and symbolic value. Herodotus records that after Leonidas fell, there was fierce fighting to recover his corpse. The Greek accounts emphasize that comrades fought desperately around that center. Whether the Persians took the body immediately or whether it was later seized, stripped, and displayed, has variations in the tradition. Herodotus reports vividly that Xerxes ordered cruel acts upon the fallen and that the Persians desecrated bodies. Later authors amplify the detail. The key point is not the precise manner of mutilation, but the political effect. The sight of a king's corpse dishonored inflamed Greek sentiment. Ancient war ritual mattered. In many Greek city-states, the proper recovery and burial of the dead was civic imperatives. To let a body lie unburied was a moral shock. The Persians' handling of the bodies, whether they stripped armor, left corpses unburied, or displayed heads on stakes, created a narrative that could be used by Greek leaders to unify and to justify vengeance. Herodotus treats these reports as worth recording. His telling casts Xerxes as both triumphant and impious, a king who in victory committed acts that closed off the moral high ground. That moral outrage was exactly the asset the Greeks needed. Outrage is a form of political capital. Spartans and other allies used stories of mistreatment to stiffen resolve. It is an old and effective rhetorical move. Convert suffering into a moral claim, and the claim becomes a call to arms. The Persians had the physical field. The Greeks had a moral field. Thermopylae traded ground for a narrative. The price in blood was real. The return in political energy was immediate. But there was another quieter consequence to the stand: time. Thermopylae delayed Xerxes' timetable. Days that would have been used to push a naval and land squeeze across the Aegean were instead spent in the calculus of dealing with an obstinate defense. Themistocles used that breathing room. He had been building a naval strategy that depended on luring the Persian fleet into confined waters where large numbers of ships could not maneuver effectively and where the Greek triremes, lighter and more maneuverable, could strike. The delay at Thermopylae afforded time for diplomatic entreaties and for fear to do its work. Cities that had been mildly resistant to Greek coordination now heard the tales of the stand and of the Persian swagger, and they recalculated. Salamis was not a foregone conclusion. It was a risky gamble. But the narrow straits there amplified Greek advantages in oarsmanship and ship handling and played to the weaknesses of the Persian multinational fleet, which depended on numbers and open water. Thermopylae was not a victory in itself, but it was a lid on Xerxes' timetable that allowed the larger strategy to take shape. When the fleets clashed, the Greek victory at Salamis reversed the narrative. The Persian offensive could not be sustained. Thermopylae had, in effect, performed the job Sparta had agreed to: buy time and send a signal that galvanized the rest. When the smoke of the campaigns cleared into the longer political aftermath, the story of Leonidas was already being shaped. Monuments were erected. Songs were sung. The poet Simonides is later credited in tradition with composing an epitaph for the fallen at Thermopylae, those famous lines that tell the passerby to say that the Spartans obeyed their laws. Whether Simonides wrote exactly that epigram, or whether it represents a later compositional theme, the effect was the same. The dead were turned into an ethical object lesson. They were fitted into a civic catechism: obedience, sacrifice, polis above self. The funerary cult that followed was not only mourning, it was reframing. It made the death instructive. That reframing was then reused politically. Sparta, for all its private brutality, also knew how to exploit its narratives. The ephors and the kings, though at odds, found in Thermopylae a source of prestige that could be deployed. The image of the warrior king who stands while others flee served Sparta's interests in the Greek world by burnishing its claim to martial excellence. Over generations, the story ossified. Oral reports became written histories. Herodotus preserved versions that were already composed of fact and selection. Later historians and poets, Thucydides, Plutarch, Aeschylus, and dramatists, took those versions and adapted them to their purposes. The man who may have been a pliable, third-born prince became a symbol of transcendence. Here is a painful irony. The same system that had turned Leonidas into an instrument now used the image of his instrument to legitimate itself. The agoge continued. The helot system persisted. Spartan law remained oriented toward the demands of war. The population of true Spartiate citizens, however, was shrinking over the centuries, partly due to census rules, land concentration, and constant warfare. The system that produced Leonidas had structural limits that it could not indefinitely paper over with legends. The story of Thermopylae helped mask those limits by transferring the cost of social order onto a set of idealized dead. Modern memory compounds the old myth. In the 19th and 20th centuries, Europeans and Americans found in the Spartan legend an ideal of martial discipline and masculine virtue. Writers and artists reworked Epictetus-like stoicism into a militaristic aesthetic. Cinema in the 21st century distilled volume and simplicity into a single image. A cloak, a spear, a king who stands in an impossible frame. The popular imagination prefers clear forms. And the story of Leonidas fits those preferences. It is visually compact and morally enticing. But history resists neatness. When we peel apart the civic architecture behind Thermopylae, the ethos, the Carnea rules, the living sun's condition, the helot economy, the agoge's pedagogy, the line between hero and instrument is not a crack, but a fault. Leonidas personified both. He acted with courage and endurance. He also served as a point where Sparta's institutions could externalize a cost. To call him only a heroic individual is to gloss the institutional violence that placed him there. To call him only a tool is to flatten the courage of men who chose, in their thinking and feeling, to stand. Historians must hold both truths. We must acknowledge the bravery of men who faced overwhelming odds and die with honor as they conceived it. We must also acknowledge the design of a polity that shaped and fed on that bravery for continuation. There is moral ambiguity at the core of Thermopylae because the event inhabits both the intimate sphere of human courage and the structural sphere of state calculation. The aftermath of Thermopylae offers a second paradox. The Persians won the field. They took the pass. Yet militarily, their long-term campaign faltered. Salamis forced a strategic retreat. Subsequent battles, Plateau and Mycale, ended with Greek strategic advantages. Psychologically, the defense at Thermopylae had become a talisman. It was a prompt for solidarity. It was used by leaders to stir cities to arms. The link between symbolic sacrifice and practical gain is not metaphysical. It is political. Stories move men. Stories solidify alliances. Thermopylae's narrative function converted a tactical delay into a strategic lever. But stories also simplify morally uncomfortable realities. The rituals that chose which men could go, those men with living sons, with heirs to secure lineage, tell a story of selective sacrifice. The obligation to produce heirs was not an affective desire only. It was an economic and legal necessity for a regime that required a narrow pool of full citizens to hold its hegemony. If Sparta could sacrifice the bodies of its elite, but still keep their seed, it perpetuated the very demographic and political structures that made extreme sacrifice profitable. The living son's rule was not merely about honor, it was about preserving the institutional backbone. We can, and should, interrogate the Delphic oracle's role in all this. Oracles are not mere supernatural pronouncements. They are social technologies that create consent. When an oracle speaks, ambiguous, ritual, and authoritative, it can be read as divine mandate, as a political tool, or as both. Herodotus preserves reports of the oracle's pronouncements with a mix of credulity and skepticism. The oracle's alleged charge that a king must die was a powerful legitimizer. It permitted Sparta to frame death as not simply necessity, but sanctified offering. The intrinsic ambiguity of oracles made them pliable. Leaders could interpret them to support the course that political exigency had already made desirable. There is another layer worth attending to: memory and the making of monument. The Spartans set up markers. Later, Greek and non-Greek writers copied and commented. Over centuries, the cumulative effect was to make the event larger than life. The story of Thermopylae became a text read and reread according to the ideological needs of each era. For Athenians, it mattered because it showed that the Persian threat could be resisted. For Spartans, it affirmed a civic ethic. For later Europeans, it offered a template for martial valor. Each reading emphasized certain lines and suppressed others. The process of turning historical event into myth is itself a political act. And the person at the center of that act, Leonidas, was both subject and object. He was subject in that he acted, he decided, he died. He was object in that his death was used, molded, praised, and justified. Over time, the objecthood became dominant in many retellings, Leonidas as icon. But archival work pushes back. The archival record, thin and mediated as it is, still returns us to the institutional scaffolding that placed him there. To understand Thermopylae is to see both the human and the machinery. This is not simply an exercise in cynical deflation. Recognizing manufacture does not negate nobility. On the contrary, it deepens the ethical question. If we know a polity-engineered sacrifice, do we lower the cost of admiration? Or do we admire more carefully? Both responses are humanly possible. We can admire a man's courage while condemning the structures that directed him to die. We can accept the power of narrative while exposing the interests that shaped it. That dual posture is the historian's necessary stance. Across the centuries, the Spartan image has been retooled repeatedly. In some eras, it was a conservative ideal. In others, it was a revolutionary fear. Modern filmmakers have focused on theatrical clarity and cathartic violence. That is their right as artists. But the cinematic Leonidas, the self-sacrificing, almost spiritual hero, isolated from institutional context, must be corrected if we want live fidelity to the archive. The filmic image is not wrong about bravery. It is incomplete about causality. If we return to the title's blunt claim, Leonidas was no hero, he was engineered. What are we saying? We are saying that the man was shaped by institutions that sought specific ends, and those ends included the symbolic use of his death. We are saying that the agoge transformed boys into instruments, that the ephors and their law limited the king's options, that the living son's rule selected bodies for sacrifice in a manner calculated to preserve the city-state's reproductive base. We are saying that the Delphic oracle functioned as ritual authorization for costly action. Those are historical claims supported by sources, interpretation, and institutional reading. But the claim does not have to be a wall. There is room for nuance. Being engineered does not erase agency. Men at Thermopylae chose to stand in the moment. They performed acts of courage and loyalty as they understood them. That brave performance, whether framed by law or not, offered a moral content that later generations could and did import into a tradition of noble sacrifice. The paradox remains. Leonidas was both artifact and actor. He was a product of a system and a person who acted in ways that produced meaning beyond the system's immediate calculations. So when we ask whether to call him hero or monster, the honest historian resists the binary. He was a figure who straddled categories. For Sparta, he was evidence that the system could sacrifice its finest without collapsing. For the Greek world, he became a symbol that justified unified resistance. For posterity, he became an archetype of deliberate self-sacrifice. For us, with hindsight and comparative civic vocabulary, he is a reminder that institutions can valorize deeds they themselves manufacture, that awareness should not erase admiration for personal bravery. It should make us suspicious of easy hero worship that ignores the hands that placed men in harm's way. In the end, Thermopylae's deepest lesson may be less about swords and more about stories. States need stories to bind citizens. Rituals, laws, and oracles supply those stories with sanction. Men like Leonidas supply the dramatic moment that stories require. When the story works, it consolidates power. When the story is retold, it often loses the memory of the mechanisms that made it possible. That is why critical history matters. To know the knot of institutional design behind a famous death is not to strip it of meaning. It is to understand how meaning was made, and thus to engage with it more responsibly. The man who stood at the pass still shades the horizon of Western memory. He still invokes strength and refusal. He still parts the crowd of history like a narrow gate. But to see him fully is to see both the bronze and the scaffolding. It is to see a hero bound into an apparatus that both produced and consumed him. The beauty of his stand resides not solely in the isolated imagery of courage, but in the moral tension. A man's brave death used by a state to keep itself alive. Leonidas was not a simple icon of virtue. He was a designed instrument whose death yielded a power beyond his personal intent. He was, in other words, both monster and maker's emblem, shaped to be used to shape memory. To call him only one thing would be to flatten that complexity. History will keep returning to Thermopylae because it offers a compact case study in the politics of sacrifice. It asks uncomfortable questions about how societies demand and manage death. It forces us to examine what we praise and why. And when the story is told honestly, acknowledging both manufacture and courage, it becomes more than a tale of heroism. It becomes a cautionary example of how institutions can turn devotion into policy. So remember the image. A king in a crimson cloak, spear forward, spear returned. Remember also the institutions that taught him to hold that spear. Remember the boys taken at 7, the helots who labored so others could train, the ephors who managed kings, the oracle that sanctified loss, the rule that selected men who could leave sons. Remember the paradox and feel its weight. You have seen the machinery. You have seen the man. Which is the truer memory? The question is not simply about historical labels. It is about how we now value courage and consent, duty and engineering. Leonidas will remain a powerful figure because his death binds these categories together in ways that refuse easy answers. If you want a closer look at the post-war politics, the funerary cult, and how Thermopylae's memory was used across the centuries, from sculpture to symposium to stadium, watch the linked deep dive on the aftermath and myth-making. There's more to untangle there, the poetry, the monuments, and the long shadow that made Leonidas both monster and martyr. Leonidas was not merely a hero born whole. He was forged, he was chosen, he was sent. He died as Sparta intended, and history, capable of both admiration and critique, must hold that dual truth without letting either erase the other. Leonidas was a product of a brutal machine. He was also a man who stood and did not retreat. That is the paradox that will keep his story alive, and, if we are honest, uneasy.